welcome. My name is Chris Berniger, and I have the honor and privilege to be the chair of the Board of Trustees here at the Allentown Art Museum. To start, I'd like to acknowledge a few individuals that are joining us tonight. First and foremost, Pennsylvania Secretary of Revenue and Honorary Trustee of the Museum, Pat Brown. Thank you for being here. And my apologies, Zach, we haven't met yet. Zach Sobek from U.S. Congressman Ryan McKenzie's office. Museums are more than buildings filled with art. They are living spaces where history, creativity, and community converge. Tonight, we are gathered not only to celebrate our museum and our exciting future, but to gain perspective from one of the country's foremost leaders of complex institutions in art history, Dr. Dan Weiss. Dan is a Homewood Professor of Humanities at Johns Hopkins University and President Emeritus of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, where Dan served from 2015 through 2023, including Dan's appointment as Chief Executive Officer of the Met starting in 2017. Prior to the Met, Dan was the president of Lafayette College here in the Valley, as well as Haverford College in suburban Philadelphia. Dan holds an MBA from Yale and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Dan has authored 7 books, including his most recent, Why the Museum Matters, which we're going to discuss this evening. Joining Dan this evening will be our very own Max Weintraub. Max, president and CEO of our museum. Max holds a PhD in History of Art from Bryn Mawr College and 2 Masters of Arts. Tonight's program, we're going to start. Dan's going to come to the podium and he's going to share perhaps the background, his thoughts that led to his latest book, and that will then evolve into a discussion. Dan and Max are going to go on stage and have an open discussion about the book, about the topic, and then the program this evening will end with questions from you all. So we hope that makes sense. Dan, it is our privilege to host you this evening. So without any further delay, Dan Weiss.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to see all of you here, and a wonderful chance for me and my wife Sandra to be back in the Lehigh Valley. We had so many great years at Lafayette, and so many friends are here. It's really a privilege to be with you. And I really enjoy the opportunity to talk a little bit about museums and this project that led to the book that I wrote recently. And then Max and I can have a discussion, and we're happy to open it up for questions and reflect on what your thoughts are, what's of concern to you. So I'll start by saying a little bit about this book, the impetus for the book, what I was hoping to understand, and what I learned in the process. During the time that COVID came upon us and we had to close the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the entire country had to deal with the onset of this pandemic, I was reflecting carefully on what it is about museums that makes them important, why they function in our society. As an art historian and a medievalist, I have studied throughout my career the ways in which human beings connect to objects, and how, going back to the earliest moments in history, as far back as we can record, there is a fundamental human desire to collect objects, create art, curate it in ways to tell stories and define identity. And within that context, I was reflecting on why is it that museums, where do they come from? What makes them so important in our society? So I used some of the COVID time to write the book. And in reflecting on those questions, I had the opportunity to develop my thinking. So I began with the idea that actually we think about museums as an experiment that come out of the Enlightenment. In the 18th century, in the 17th century, we see the advent of museums across the European landscape. And then by the 19th century, museums begin to emerge around the United States, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Wadsworth Atheneum, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and so forth. But in thinking about that, I really discovered that there's a much longer history, that museums actually have a history that dates back much further than that. So in the book, I started to trace that idea. As I outlined the book, and I proposed my idea to Yale University Press, the editor said, that all sounds very interesting, but why don't you write a history of museums, because it seems like there's a theme here worth exploring. And I said, I think it's a great idea. The only problem is I don't know anything about it. And she said, now you have your homework. Go learn and write it. So I did, and it was actually incredibly useful because it gave me a chance to think about that context. We know that in the world today, in the United States, there's something like 40 or 45,000 museums in this country alone. And that tells us that they play a fundamental role in our society, that they are deeply important. We value them greatly. Most of them are funded by the members of the community, not the government. They are community experiments and social enterprises that are extraordinarily important. So I backed up the lens and I thought about this historical question. And when we think about the rise of museums, we can really take it back to antiquity. And we think about, for example, in the ancient world, the Neo-Babylonian tyrant Nebuchadnezzar II, when he conquered Jerusalem and other cities, they collected art and brought it back as booty to their civilizations, to their palaces, and they displayed it. He even had a curator to bring this art together in ways to tell stories. And we see that how that idea develops throughout the ancient world. If we think about the great artistic achievements in Athens, the Acropolis, the Parthenon, for those of you who have been, and you can see this great monument that is a reflection of the values of the Greeks and the rise of democracy in the 6th century BC, we see that from that moment on, people visited those sites the same way people visit the Allentown Art Museum or the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In the 2nd century, for example, Pausanias, who was a Greek traveler, he was sort of an inveterate tourist. He traveled all over the world and wrote about it. He visits the Acropolis in Athens at that time, and he describes his experiences the way you might describe your visit to Athens today. I went to the top of the Acropolis, to the Erechtheum, and I saw the statues there. Then I went in a gallery by the Propylaea, and I saw images of Odysseus, or images of this and that. And it's this sense of experience that one has, just like a tourist today. So this is to say that those ideas go back a long time, and our museums today are really connected inexorably to human ideas that go back thousands of years. That said, in the Roman world, so the Greeks created all this art, they had all of these monuments that were not thought of explicitly as museums. As the Roman Empire began to take over the Greek world, these guys were collectors of art. People like Cicero, the great rhetorician and lawyer, who was also an inveterate art collector. And he had a guy traveling around Greece buying art for him to bring back to his palace. Romans were avid collectors of art. And around that time, and I will describe the moment that I believe the art museum as we understand it was invented. And it was invented in the moment of crisis in Rome, as the Roman Republic was about to crumble under Caesar to become an empire. During that time, these people were all collecting art. They were interested in art. Julius Caesar he crosses the Rubicon, he wins the civil wars, he becomes an emperor for life, and he was about to commission a museum. And he was then assassinated within a year. So the emperor for life was gone, and the Roman civilization was in great crisis. The hero of our story is a guy named Gaius Pollio, who was a historian, a general, a poet, a leader of men. He was admired by everyone. He decided at this time, because he was worried about the loss of liberty that a republic that is crumbling would entail, he decided to create a museum and a public library in Rome so that ideas can live. Because his view was that if people can understand and learn and be connected, they'll be better citizens. Because he was worried again about the loss of what they valued, a republic. So he created this public library, the first public library ever created, and an art museum. And he built it in a hall that was called the Hall of Liberty. So there was a very explicit kind of idea there. And it was open for everyone with that idea. So we see then, that in my view is the first officially civic public museum to be created, which is different from what happened before. So the idea is in place at this time, and then we have the Middle Ages, 1,000 years where they're not building museums, they're doing other things. And then during the period of what we call the Enlightenment, in the 17th and 18th centuries, there is the rise of interest in creating cultural institutions that look like museums, the Louvre, the British Museum, the Capitoline Museum in Rome, many of them. And they're dedicated to this idea of having public experience art. What I found interesting about tracing that history is, on the one hand, there's an inexorable human desire to connect to objects to help us to understand who we are and what's important in our world. to help build community and all of those things. But there was also a very powerful democratizing idea in the age of the Enlightenment that if we are to allow for the possibility of progress, and that human beings can actually engage the world in thoughtful ways, that the scientific method allows for discovery, which was in some ways the antithesis of religious dogma, that museums provide that opportunity for people to expand all of what they believe in. And so that's the context for how the museum idea developed. But something different happens in America in the 19th century. And that is, the motivation was similar to create museums that do those things. But there was also the idea following the Civil War that museums can also be places where people can come together in shared purpose to build something, sustain something, invest it, steward it together. And that is a democratizing idea. American museums, for the most part, are not owned by the government, with the exception of the Smithsonian or the National Gallery. They are owned by all of us. Museums were created as civic enterprises built by the community. And as a result of that foundational mission, at all museums that are founded that way, they are more vibrant, more responsive to the public, more connected to the community, and more dynamic than institutions that are owned by the government are. And so the American experiment, like American higher education, which is much the same way, distinguished itself in the 19th century by having that kind of social formation. The Met, for example, is a very good example. There were a group of industrialists, wealthy and successful business people who went to Paris for a conference, and they saw the Louvre. And because these guys were New Yorkers, they said, I want that. We got to build that in New York. And the only issue, small issue, was they wanted to build an institution on a scale and level of ambition of the Louvre, yet they had no art. It was just an idea and an ambition, an audacious one. And they created a museum that was modest in scale in the first instance, with very little art. And if one looks at what they had on the walls in the beginning, plaster casts, crappy landscapes, we're not talking about an institution with a collection that was magnificent. And that idea was so successful for the reasons I've been talking about, because it was founded by the citizens and galvanizing to the community in the Gilded Age. As people became wealthy and collectors could buy things at high levels, they could fill the museum with art that was otherwise not available. Take someone like J.P. Morgan, who was the guy who saved American capitalism, the largest banker and most powerful person in New York, and one of the most powerful in the world. His real passion in life was as an art collector. And he collected something like 13 or 15,000 works of art. And when he died, everybody wondered what's going to happen to his great wealth. And it turned out he didn't have much money. He had put so much into art that it was all in art. And in order to pay his estate taxes, half of his collection had to be sold off to pay the IRS, which is how people like Henry Clay Frick and others got Morgan's art, because they bought it. The rest of it came to the Met. So the Met went from having no medieval art of interest or importance to being the largest repository of medieval art in the United States in one gift. And so what the Met learned during the Gilded Age and in the years following was that you can build those collections by engaging them in this mission, inspiring them to support it, and effectively collecting collectors. That is, you can get one work of art at a time, but you can also engage a collector who has hundreds of works of art. When the Annenbergs gave their collection of Impressionist art to the Met in the 70s, they went from having a perfectly good collection of Impressionist art to the best collection of Impressionist art outside of France. So this is just to say that that idea of a social experiment has so many values that accrue in our society, not just in creating places that inspire people, but because they're put together by the community and run by the community, they have this democratizing effect because we learn to work together. Whatever our politics are, people who are engaged in these institutions work in common good to make them better and to build something. They have to steward them and manage them and be accountable to the public because they are not government-owned entities. And I think the secret and sort of the miracle to the American experiment was the ways in which it drew upon these ancient human tendencies, thought about the history of the way people collected art in the ancient world and in the Enlightenment and so forth. And then we took the idea a step further. And the economic model, the social model, all created the opportunity for these institutions to transcend their peers. So if you compare, for example, again, I'll talk about the Met, which I know, with the Louvre, two of the largest museums in the world. The Louvre has a collection that is unrivaled, but its exhibition program, its publication program, its investment in scholarship is nothing like the Met's, because it's a different kind of institution. It's a government-owned museum that's a great tourist attraction that has very nice things, and they maybe do, I don't know, 10 special exhibitions a year. The Met does 40. And so it has to do with, again, what inspires these ideas in the first place. And I think, and I'll conclude here, and then Max and I can have a discussion, that what makes the museum movement in our country so interesting and so extraordinary is the ways in which there's so much diversity from museum to museum, and that every community has to engage in these ways to support it. From the Allentown Art Museum to the Philadelphia Museum of Art to the Met to the Boston Museum, they're all that way. And it is an extraordinarily successful moment. And when we think about places in our society where everyone is welcome to come together for discussion and debate and shared learning, exactly what we're doing tonight. Museums and libraries stand alone in our society. Those are the places that most represent that opportunity for us to come together. And therefore, the museum movement will continue to be strong, even though as I look around the landscape and we think about all the challenges before us, there is something inexorable and powerfully positive about what museums mean in our society. And as a result, I think their resilience will shine through no matter what the difficulties are that we face. But for that to happen, it depends on all of us to continue to invest in them as we have historically. I'm happy to pause there and engage in discussion with Max if he's ready to come up and talk to me. Otherwise, I'll just do that again. So, thank you very much. Turn it on. Maybe they don't want to hear what I have to say.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Dan, as a museum director, but also as a Haverford alum, I am thrilled to have you here tonight. I think your book has sparked important conversations about the role that the museum plays in civic life, in community identity, and in shaping our collective future. And from our perspective, this conversation tonight couldn't come at a more meaningful moment for the Allentown Art Museum. As many of you know, we are embarking on an ambitious new chapter that imagines the museum, a museum designed for deeper engagement and broader access. And so this is an incredibly timely conversation to have. And I think tonight that we'll explore the mission of museums, how they've built trust and continue to build trust, and continue to serve as spaces and as sources of inspiration, conversation, and belonging. So we'll dive in and we'll leave ample time for questions. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't first say, Dan, congratulations on your new appointment.
Thank you.
Dan came from his first board meeting today, straight from there to here, I believe. So thank you for making time for us here. I guess just a moment of personal reflection just to start. You are now, as the head of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, have been the head of two of the oldest museums in America. The Met, founded in 1870, Philadelphia in 1876. And your book focuses on this sort of universal museum, what we might colloquially call an encyclopedic museum. And so they are also two of the grandest in America, the Met having a vast collection that spans cultures and millennia and objects in the millions, and the Philadelphia Museum in the same objects in the hundreds of thousands in their collection. So just after writing a book like this, and thinking about the historic role of museums, what does that mean to you? What are your thoughts now that you're guiding a second, cultural treasure in America?
Well, having any of these jobs is a great privilege. To have an opportunity to be part of an institution that's dedicated to such an overwhelmingly positive and important mission. Here, there, all of these places. It's as good a job as one could have. I've had lousy jobs. This is not one of them. It's an immense privilege. So even on bad days, I reflect on that. And as you know, you could be having a really bad day and then just go out into the galleries and walk around for 10 minutes and you remind yourself why you're there. So the Philadelphia Museum of Art, like the Met, it's a great institution with a magnificent history. But both institutions are civic organizations that have challenges. So there are leadership challenges and management issues that any institution has that has to be taken care of. And then there is the overarching mission, which is so inspiring. And so in leading them, it requires reflecting carefully on what it takes for them to be successful. You have to balance your budgets and pay the bills and open the doors all the time. When I first got to the Met, which had all kinds of serious budget issues, I was somewhat amused by, maybe that's not the right word, the Met has to, running a college or university is a challenging job, but the operational requirements on running a museum are more taxing. You can say to the students in a university or college, for example, I know your dormitory leaks, but you're a college kid, get over it, it's no problem, we'll get to it. But you can't do that in an art museum. It has to be perfectly secure, perfect climate control, all of those things have to be right. So the operational demands on running that side of it, as you know, they're like any business, but it isn't a business. It is something else that has a mission that transcends the operational concerns. So I thought about those issues in both places, and they're all quite different. I think one of the challenges of these large museums is that they can presume they cover the landscape. But if the mission is accessibility, as you mentioned, being a place that's welcoming to all, one has to begin with the acknowledgement that we cover hardly any of the landscape. The Met is a building of 2.2 million square feet. It's the largest art museum in the world. It has 1.5 million objects. But most of the cultures that have ever existed are not represented in that building. So to say we're encyclopedic is to presume if it's important, we have it. And then people come into the museum from places that aren't represented there, and they don't feel like it's their museum. So the language we use around what this is important. I use the word universal because it's not the same as encyclopedic presumes we've got it covered, it's all here. Universalist really about the fact that we're connected to each other and that we aspire to expand our collections. And what I've learned from my experience at both places is that people notice. This generation, people come to museums in part to find themselves, to connect to the things that matter to them. 50 years ago, you came to see beautiful things. That's different. So we have to be humble about what we don't have and mindful of the fact that genuine access and connection in our institutions requires that we really figure out how to meet people where they are, whether they have PhDs in art history or they've never been in a museum before, whether they're school children or the elderly. Finding ways to make everyone feel welcome is to acknowledge what we don't fully understand and that we're open to everyone. Long answer to a short question. Sorry.
And I think that topic of the selective nature of museums and the exclusions and biases will sort of run through the course of our conversation and most of these types of conversations. But you make a compelling case that museums are essential civic institutions, even in spite of those exclusions and biases and issues that continue to be confronted, perhaps more so today than ever, or certainly in recent memory. And right. I would certainly agree about that. The essential, vital role of museums as civic institutions. And anyone who's on our mailing list knows that I've sent out emails about art and museums as a social determinant of health. Those sort of non-medical factors that can positively impact individual and collective mental and physical well-being and health. It's proven to lower cortisol levels. It can positively impact child's cognitive development. All of these incredible things that art, looking at art, making art in museums and in art institutions can do. What do you see as the most important aspect of a museum for civic life?
Well, museums operate as places of cultural inspiration and education. and that anyone who goes to a museum and who's open to it can find that experience to be transcendent. Ideally, what we hope to see is that people build connections with museums that allow them to think of them as long-term friends. And at both museums that I have led, I've been inspired by hearing stories of people who've been going to them since they were children, and that in a world of so many changes and so many things that they do, these museums may change, but not so quickly, and the works of art in them are there. So they're long-term friends. I think that's one side of it. But to your point about the civic side, museums play a very important role, as I mentioned in my remarks at the outset, in helping a society to advance its larger objectives as a social experiment, as an engine of the economy, as a place of community, and as an entity that requires inclusiveness in order for it to run properly. So again, I think I'm not an anti-government guy, but when I talk about what it means for a museum to be owned by the government, it's very different than a museum that you all own. This museum is held in trust to the public, and Max and his team and the board are accountable to all of us for it to do well and it to thrive. And in fact, from a practical point of view, a civic institution that works that way, if you don't connect with the public and you aren't able to raise money, you cannot function. You must be accountable to the community you serve. At the same time, you have a mission. So the work is more interesting and more rewarding than having a steady paycheck from one owner or entity, whether it's the government or a single donor. And so I think the magic of these as civic institutions is that they require us to think about how they live in the world, how they function. Who's on the board? Is the community represented by the board? Do we have access to the best ideas to connect to the community? Are school children in Allentown coming to this museum in sufficient numbers to have the kind of learning experience that we want them to have? If not, what's the problem? How do we solve that? Frankly, again, I don't mean to overstate that distinction, but the civic aspect of the institution requires those questions to be urgent and present, and it makes us better and sharper and more accountable than if we just have an annuity coming from someone, anyone, including the government. And so I think that's a really important thing. I'll just say one more thing again about my experience at the Met. The mission of the Met in the last generation was to turn it from being an elitist, somewhat forbidding institution at the top of the stairs to a place that's welcoming to everyone. And we discovered that many of the students in many of the boroughs would come to New York, to come to the Met with their classes, but not another country called Staten Island. Really far away, they did not come, and so the question was, why don't they come? And we went out and talked to the people in the schools and thinking about the civic responsibility. And the teachers said, we don't come because we don't have any money for buses, and we don't know how to get there otherwise. So the Met paid for the buses, and the Met figured out that the transportation is what's necessary. And what we've learned from experience in every institution is get them in the door, give them one or two experiences where they know where stuff is. How do you buy tickets? Where's the restroom? Can I eat here? Then they can come back comfortable and knowledgeable that they can navigate the place. School children in New York from families that have never been to the Met can come back with their parents because they know how to do it in first grade or second grade. So we had to buy the buses, or rent the buses, in order to make that happen. As a civic institution, that's an imperative. Otherwise, probably not. So I think, to your question, what makes us great is the fact that we're accountable to each other.
Yeah, a couple things there. One is the barriers to cultural participation, but I think that we continue to face. And we at the Allentown Art Museum, we are admission free now, thanks to there were some names on the screen when you were all coming in, and that's a huge factor, but it's not the only factor to in terms of a barrier to entry to cultural participation. But I want to just start with what you said about the European model versus the American model, and the way in which that's changed what you call, or at least the U.S. model is because it has this hybrid revenue stream versus the government support in Europe. It creates a sense of shared governance. And I wonder if you could just drill down on that a little bit and kind of what that looks like in practical terms. I mean, I think we would all agree, and certainly the last several years or more, that shared governance is reflected in a diverse board where trusteeship is just defined beyond just financial wealth. And that's an important part because you have different diverse voices on the boards. But you make trust as such an important feature of museums, and that comes out of that shared governance as you articulated in your book. Can you drill down a little bit more on that and how else that manifests in American institutions?
Sure. So I would say, to make a categorical statement, that I think shared governance is an essential element of the viability of any mission-driven institution in this country, whether it's a university or a hospital or a museum. That what I mean by that is, for a civic enterprise to operate in the ways we're talking about this evening, it requires a diversity of voices that are representative of the communities we serve. That has to include at the board level. It has to include people who can help inform decision-making and connect to the community and provide perspectives. But it goes well beyond that. It also has to include the professional staff and all of the staff in a museum and the public. And every museum in every city, no matter who owns it, has a relationship with the city government that is also important. And therefore that has to be stewarded. So I think I had the advantage when I got to work at the Met that I had spent most of my career in higher education, where shared governance is an absolute fact. That when I arrived at Haverford, for example, a liberal arts college, you all probably know, one of the students, I'm unpacking my stuff, and the student knocked on my door and he said, "Hey, Dan, welcome here." And it's like, okay, Dan, it's fine. And he said, "I have some issues I want to talk about with you, so let's get that set up on your schedule as soon as you can." And I was amused by that, but actually I love that because the students are stakeholders in the institution. They have a voice. They're not on the board, and they're not professors. But I love the idea, as a Haverfordian, and I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about, that they know that's how it works. At Lafayette, it was much the same. So I come from an environment where the premise of shared governance is an imperative. And no president ever lasts in these jobs if they don't understand that. When you read about somebody being fired in higher ed, that's thing one. And thing two, that they think they have more responsibility than they have. What I brought to the Met and to the Philadelphia Museum was that same view that you have to figure out how to make sure that all of those voices are heard in a productive way. It doesn't mean everybody's voice is equal. It doesn't mean that we in any way negate the value or power of expertise. But the challenge is, how do you make sure everybody can weigh in so that people get behind it? If you don't have a vision and a plan that people are supportive of, they're not going to show up, they're not going to contribute, they're not going to engage, and you will fail. So it is in that sense more of a political process than an executive one, because you must win people over and engage. And I grew up throughout my career with the commitment to shared governance. And what I've learned is, if you do it well, you can engage in a process that's long and slow and deliberative if that's the issue and you have time for that. Or it can be much quicker. When we had to close the museum because of COVID, there wasn't a lot of shared governance. There couldn't be. But when we made difficult decisions, like what to do about the fact that the Metropolitan had 9 galleries with the Sackler's name on them, and we were living through this crisis of opioids and Purdue Pharma, complicated question. The board, I created a task force of trustees and staff, and we spent 2 years working the problem. And we came up with a solution, I'm proud to say, that worked for us and every other institution in the world that had Sackler names copied our model, because we studied it and worked hard and tried to figure it out. So I think shared governance is a creative challenge, but an imperative to get right, and it's central to the value of what these institutions represent.
On that point with the Sacklers, I would just point out, I thought it was really courageous in your book that you make the case, you platform the museum mission over what some might consider objectionable money. And if it's in the service of, there's always a line, but ultimately it's in the service, if it's in the service of advancing the mission, that has to be factored into the calculus of accepting money from anyone.
Right. It's an interesting question. If we depend on philanthropic support for our institutions, Each institution on its own has to determine, how do we think about a line or acceptability? If our mission is to produce programming and art for the public, we're not a social club, so we don't turn away donors because they're not funny or they're irritating or brusque, but there are donors that we can all think of we might not accept gifts from. And so we had to work through that question. How do you draw that line? Why would you draw that line? What are the implications of drawing that line? And every institution has to figure that out for themselves. But as a thought exercise, you can all come up with your own names of people where it would be very bad for the Allentown Art Museum to accept a gift from any, you can figure them out, I could name them. And so we had to work through that. And in order to do that in the case of the Sacklers, it felt that it's very important. We can't get ahead of what the law has determined. It's not up to us to decide if people are guilty or innocent if there hasn't been a legal process. We're just art guys. We're not a court. So how do we develop a process that's responsive to the public concern, that is fair to the individuals, that is based on the facts that are available to us, and that limits the institution from liability problems as well? Sometimes these donors who go south, that you have a legal commitment to have their name up forever, and it doesn't say anywhere in the gift agreement that you can take their name down. And then when they get indicted for murder, you have to figure out what to do about that, because they could still win a lawsuit against you if the contract calls for that. So that's why it took us 2 years to figure it out.
Back to considering museums as civic enterprises and the shared responsibility that goes into that. I guess advice, but what are your thoughts on, not every community or individuals in every community understand or appreciate the link between culture and quality of life, between the arts and quality of life. And a lot of your book kind of doesn't assume that, but it privileges that belief. But I think, with people, just, basic necessities can be struggle. I mean, when you're talking about shared responsibility in communities of all different sizes, Allentown, Philadelphia, and everything in between, how do you handle that when shared responsibility is so important to your model of past, present, and future museums, that when the arts flourish, civic life flourishes. I think you and I would, obviously nod our heads at that. But how do you bridge that gap?
Well, I think what each museum has to do is to reflect carefully on how you can best serve the communities that are around you. And it is not our obligation to persuade every individual that the art museum is a place they need to come to, or that everybody has to love art. We live in a pluralistic society, and some people don't, and that's okay. But I think it's up to us to be important advocates, compelling advocates, for why at every level what we do is worth people's time and interest, and that we make it as easy as possible to welcome people into the museum, recognizing, as I say, we don't want to be condescending to people, and just because somebody doesn't know a lot about art, we don't want them to feel that they're not welcome. When the Met was founded, there was this great democratizing idea that we're here for everybody, except we'll be closed on Sundays because we don't want to be open on Sundays, and all the people they wanted to come work 6 days a week except Sunday, so they couldn't come. And there were all other kinds of barriers. There was, for example, not until maybe 30 years ago, there was no sign outside the Met telling you it was the Met. Because if you don't know what it is, you probably shouldn't come. And those were subtle kinds of forms of discrimination and elitism that we have to get past. So you figure out how to make your institution welcoming, but it's important, I think really important, not to pander to them. Just because people don't know a lot about art doesn't mean they're ignorant, doesn't mean that they're stupid. They don't know. So how do you create interesting programming that helps them to learn something without condescending to them? And how do you create enough varied programming also to be interesting to people who have experience? And if you can do those things, and at the same time make clear to the community, and particularly government leaders and others, what else you do for the community. Every art museum is an economic engine for the community. Allentown, without the Allentown Art Museum, is a severely diminished place. It does something important, not only for people who come in, but for the larger society, for restaurants and hotels and all those other things. The single largest engine of the economy in New York City is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we produce a report every couple of years and show them the many billions of dollars that this institution helps to generate. So I think, without being hectoring people or being overly evangelical, making that case because we have an obligation to be accountable. All of our museums receive a government subsidy in the form of tax advantages for donors. The government, the Revenue Act of the Internal Revenue Act of 1917 made it tax deductible to make gifts to museums. That money would otherwise go to the government. So we have an obligation to make sure that we're making our case in ways that shows we're worthy of that kind of forbearance. And arrogance and indifference to those issues undermines the mission. So it's finding the balance to recognize we have to be out there, but not too much out there.
And I thought it was really interesting in your book. I mean, I think people who are thinking about it might, a through line of the development to the modern museum might emphasize the sort of cabinets of curiosity and the Wunderkammers that were, more exclusive domains. They sort of pseudo-scientific collections that may have a unicorn horn in it, but also have scientific and artistic and cultural wonders. As at a time of exploration when the world is opening up, and that was a way to understand it. But your through line is really more a democratic one, right? Looking at public forums, public spaces, public access to the arts. And so I'd like to just hear your thoughts a little bit more. I mean, you platform, Jürgen Habermas's ideas about the public sphere, which were idealizing 18th century salons and coffee houses that were, had its own exclusions, right? Like women weren't in those bourgeois salons, and people of color certainly not, and working class weren't included in those conversations. So it's, in many ways, it was still an ideal even to Habermas. But what do you see as so you talk about the centering of art spaces as a place for conversation, sometimes difficult conversations.
Right.
But what other barriers do you see to that participation, the cultural participation that a museum is so central to, even if we're thinking of it as publicly accessible? Because again, we're in the minority, just not offering admission, right? That still puts us in the distinct minorities. What other barriers do you see, and what was at stake for you to center that more democratic through line of museums?
Right. Well, the democratizing impulse is intended to encourage people to come and make them feel welcome, and they have part of what it does, can be part of what the institution does. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't have art that stimulates and inspires and cabinet of curiosities to expand people's understanding of how complicated the world is. One of the great roles a museum can play is to show people how bigger and more complicated the world is than you think it is. And that people have certain views about societies that they have. I don't like that culture. I find those people ignorant. And then they go see these things in a museum and think, well, maybe I'm not right about that. Maybe the world's more complicated than I think it is. So on the one hand, one wants to be democratizing, but again, it's not to pander and just produce programming at the lowest common denominator. So one issue of access is to make sure that the institution is fascinating, inspiring, and rich in its programming to take people out of their comfort zone without harassing them. And that's a good thing. But if we think of museums as places of community in the ways you're talking about, where we want people to have access, you need to solve the admissions problem, and that's a challenge. Free is great, and it's wonderful if you can be free. I faced this issue at the Met. But somebody has to pay for it. And if it's not free, then who's going to pay for it if the government isn't paying for it? That's an economic problem that deserves serious discussion. And I faced that issue very directly at the Met, and I made unpopular decisions, and I can talk about those if one wants to talk about it. But the issue of access requires that. Then once they're inside, you can say we're devoted to freedom of expression. It's really important that we have, like Habermas said, places of salons where everybody can come and debate. But what we've learned in our society, that's really hard to do. It's increasingly in the world today, disagreeing with each other is not a skill we any longer have at a high level. So if we want to model freedom of discourse and genuine exchange of ideas. There need to be certain principles. It's a skill you have to know how to do. And this is a much bigger, more complicated societal issue than a museum issue. But in the book, I talked about some of the rules one has to have about how do you do that. For example...
Rules of engagement, you call them.
Yes, exactly. So one of them, I'll just mention 2 or 3. One of them is there's a very big difference between bad ideas and bad people. You can disagree with someone, but it doesn't make them evil. And how does one not demonize somebody whose ideas are different? If you practice a certain kind of understanding of that, it helps us to keep the discourse at a more civic level. Another is there should be no hierarchy of ideas. Just because I'm the director of the museum doesn't mean I have the best idea. More often than not, it means I don't have the best idea. So how do you ensure that people understand they can disagree with you? Whether it's in a room like this, you can ask any question you want. And that's what we're here for. But if there's a hierarchy that you shouldn't ask difficult questions of your boss, then you begin to lose the capacity of ideas to be most important. So there are these guidelines one could think about to allow for free discourse. And I would say that's one of the most urgent problems we face in our society today. And without making this discussion a political one, if one looks at how Congress engages in discussion across difference, they are, I think, a monument to how to do it badly. When in fact, we must learn how to do it well, because that's how you learn. The only way we advance as individuals in our learning is to be confronted with our ignorance. That's how you grow in what you learn. And if all you do is are cosseted by what you already know, then we don't get very far. So the imperative is to figure it out, and museums are a great laboratory because here we are, we're in a room, how do we do it? And directors have to think about that all the time.
Yeah, I think you once described, I saw you describe that learning as happening at the edges of our ignorance, which was kind of a beautiful way to just say it.
Thank you.
Just thinking about that, the tension in your book between the enduring mission of the museum to preserve the past and to also, be in the present moment and be a forum for ideas, contemporary ideas and debates. That leads to, we're engaging with issues of, post-colonial, issues of power and representation. But
right.
What do you think, just in that sphere, in that realm, with this sort of tension between the mission to preserve the past and to also stay in the present, as that arena, as you say, what are museums doing really well in that space, and where can they improve?
I think one of the greatest contributions to advancing that question in the last generation has been the almost universal belief among all museums that we need to be accessible to people. We aren't just places. There used to be a view, we're going to create a great institution with beautiful things. Come if you want. You don't have to come. That's okay. It's not for everybody. But we're here. And no longer do museums, no museum has that view. They have the view that what we want to do is find a way to connect with communities in the ways we've been talking about this evening. Ideally, again, without pandering, but thinking about the stories we tell, the programs that we mount that invite people in. So I think museums have learned to do that increasingly well. And every museum, if you're sitting in meetings among the leadership of the museums, and I've had the benefit of doing that a lot, many institutions, this is always like thing 1 or 2 to talk about. How are we doing? How are we engaging the communities? So it's figuring out. The longer answer to your question is every museum has to figure out for itself how to take your mission and activate it. And every museum actually has a slightly different mission. And one needs to understand what that is and what relationship that mission has and that collection has to the past. The Museum of Modern Art, for example, in New York, has a very different mission than the Metropolitan does in terms of its relationship to the past and the kind of questions it wants to answer. Or ask, rather. What we collect at the Met, for example, there was lots of discussion about how leading edge should the Met be. Should we be collecting the art of living artists that are very controversial? Is that right for the museum? And my view was that's not our wheelhouse. We are more of a canon. We should be collecting art that has already been vetted. There are other kinds of museums that can be on the leading edge all over the landscape, including in New York City and elsewhere. But you have to sort that out to determine how do you relate to the past to the present. And then the other dimension to think about is, how does one engage the public in conversation that is stimulating without being simply provocative for the sake of being provocative? Some museums like to do that. That's not my thing. There are ways to engage issues that invite discussion and disagreement, but not just putting something out there just to get people mad. I don't think that's necessary. That's kind of, I think, intellectually less interesting. But each museum has to ask, what's our mission, what's our collection, what's our relationship to history, and how do we operate authentically within that frame? And every museum would have a different answer.
And I think we'll open it up to the floor questions after one selfish question from me, which is, if you were embarking, you worked at two major museums where you inherited the building accretions of multiple buildings all into one. If you were hypothetically building a building, say in Allentown, what would be the one sort of non-negotiable architectural or design element of that building to sort of conform with your ideas, your principles of the museum as a civic space?
That's a wonderful question. And not everybody gets the benefit to build something new. So good for you. I would say in the course of my career as a college president and a museum leader, I have had the occasion to build or significantly renovate many, many projects. And what I've learned from experience is the most important advice I have is think really carefully about what kind of spaces do you want to create that will endure. You're going to get to replace this building in 100 years, and you're probably not going to be around to do it. So in the years that you're here, how do you create a building that has enduring value, that's not so trendy or whimsical that you have this really cool room that's going to leak in 2 years and the light's not right, but the architect loves it? So my short answer is, be a good client, which means make the architect work for you. And the more marquee the architect is, the more they say, I'm an artist, I'm a visionary, you're lucky to have me, here's what we're going to do. And there are institutions that accept that. Lots of them. Because after all, that's somebody. That's IMPay, or that's Cesar Pelli, or whoever it is. If you're not a good client, then you're going to end up with their building and not your building. So it's important to be thoughtful about that, and as you work through that process, make sure you're asking all the questions that come to mind, because in the end, even an architect that does museums for a living, they haven't done this museum. They don't know your mission as you do. And so in my experience, a good architect welcomes that discussion. A bad architect doesn't want to hear from you. So that's my advice.
And no skylights.
Well, there's that. Right.
So we'll open it up to the floor. And please raise your hand if you have a question. We'll hand the mic to you, and please stand up when you're asking your question. Hi, Chris.
Thank you both. What a wonderful discussion. I'm going to build on the theme that Max just spoke to, looking into the future, Dr. Weiss, and specifically if the goal is, stating the obvious, to maintain relevance and to continue to instigate curiosity by the general public. Thinking about the generational changes of our communities and thinking about the digitalization of all of our lives. In your opinion, have you thought about the application or the use of technology? Museums are just wonderful reflections of history, but thinking into the future and embracing technology and what might be important to future generations. Is there an opportunity, perhaps, is really maybe my curiosity, is there an opportunity to embrace technology for future persons and their interests?
Yes, I think absolutely there is. If we were having this conversation, say, 10 years ago, and we would be talking about the advent of increasingly spectacularly capable technologies, people would be asking, you can get a digital image of a work of art that's so clear and crisp. Why do I have to come to your museum anyway? I can just look at it on my screen. And what we've learned from that experience is that the more magnificent the image is on the screen, the more people want to meet the real thing. That it creates a certain interest in the real thing, because as I began my remarks, one of the things that I have learned as a professor of medieval art and studying the history of human engagement with objects, we really need to connect to the material world in ways to help define who we are, tell stories about who we are, shape our sense of the universe based on those kinds of things, objects and artifacts. That won't change no matter how slick the technologies are, in my view. So what we now see with the advent of AI and the next level of technologies, none of us can predict what's going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years. When we think about AI 5 years ago, I mean, who even knew what it was? And now every time you do a Google search, AI is helping you get the answer, if you want to write an essay or whatever it is. So I think museums should embrace the world we live in and not try to keep it out and say, well, we're a place for real objects. We don't have room for technology. What most museums don't have the ability to do is to be a technology leader, because we don't have the capital or the expertise. When I was at the Met, there was a lot of pressure from people to say, we need to be the leading edge of technology in art museums. And I said, that's a great idea, except for one thing. We don't know anything. You know, we are not technology leaders. We run an art museum. But we could reach out to Apple and to Microsoft and say to them, we'd like to work with you. And we did. And they know how to do that. So I think it's important to be an adapter at the right rate and not ahead of yourself, to understand what you're doing as it relates to mission. But I think we're facing an astonishing transformation in the entire world based on what AI can do, and all of you guys know more than I do about this. It's the world we're in. But museums have to live in the world. They are repositories of history. We keep the past. We tell stories about art. But we also have to live in the world around us, so we have to be nimble and responsive. That's one reason why you need a diverse board, because you have people on the board who know more about that than we do, and we'll figure it out together. Thank you.
I have you just answered part of my question, but I'm still curious about the rest of it. I see a museum as having a function of, one, maintaining a canon and educating the public on the canon of what is available. The second function could be to educate the public on what's coming, what's new and modern and developing, and where that's going, and so they have some understanding and appreciation of what might be available in the way of art. I understand fully that could be, that's a decision must be made at the local level as to what do you want to do. But if you were to take the attitude that you want to be an exponent of new and developing art, how would you manage that?
Well, I think in order to collect well, to study objects thoughtfully, and to present that material in ways that's compelling, you need to have a professional staff who's competent to do that, who knows how to do that. And the field of contemporary art, art that's being made right now, has really no history. It's in the world right now and it's out there. So it's a different kind of engagement than, say, art that has a history. So if a museum wants to be a meaningful participant in the contemporary scene of art, it needs to make sure it has some understanding of the dynamics of that field, and it brings in curatorial expertise to do that. And my own view is that one shouldn't do that unless you're set up to do that. Because again, the Met, and by the way, my successor at the Met does not fully agree with me on this. He likes to be a little bit edgy, and that's okay. It's just not exactly was my view, and every director will have a different view. But you have to be willing to take chances. If you're collecting things that might be, they're not really tested yet, it's hard to know what the world thinks of them. 200 years ago, you could have bought a painting by Vermeer for, I don't know, a few $1,000s. Today, you could buy one for a few $100 million. And that's because for hundreds of years, nobody cared about him till somebody discovered him. So it's not always clear. Again, if the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the Met, the two museums I know the best, they're not in the business of wild speculation about what might be hot, what might be worth keeping. But you have to figure that out for each institution as to what it is you're doing. But when you bring something into an institution, a museum, deaccessioning, which is the getting rid of works of art, is not something you're supposed to do all day long. You're supposed to take these things in to be yours forever. And so there should be a process of reflection, and every museum will have a different view of that. So start with mission, and then have professional staff help you figure out how to execute.
I would just add, I think that in your book, there's a full-throated defense of professionalism and expertise, which I think is sometimes left out of the conversation. So thank you for that.
If I can just make a quick comment about that. That came up a lot, where people would say, if we all want to be involved, why do we have to listen to curators all the time? We want to, I love art, I want to have an opinion. And I would say, yes, I agree, you should have an opinion. But if you're not trained and you have no background in that, we have to respect expertise. I'm pretty sure we all defer to expertise when we're choosing a cardiologist. We don't just say, well, that guy, he's seen a movie about the heart, he probably can help me. And in the world of art, there's less at stake in terms of our own health, but expertise should always be respected. And that means that the ways in which people contribute would be different. But a society benefits by valuing knowledge and effort and expertise.
I wonder if you could comment a bit on the difference in mission and practice that happens in a place like the Metropolitan, which clearly has an international audience that it's appealing to, and a place like Allentown and many of the other regional museums that clearly are appealing to a much more local or regional audience. I assume that makes some significant differences in mission and practice?
Yes, I think it does. It's important to, on the one hand, have a sense of what your mission is, and on the other, to have a sense of your audience. And then the operating constraint is always resources. Every museum faces that, except maybe the Getty. Everybody else has to live in the world and think about resources and what's possible and what's not possible. And so for a regional museum that serves a local community like the Allentown Art Museum, that doesn't mean you're not going to get international visitors or people from all over the country. But if the preponderance of the audience you serve are more local, then it's worth asking, how do we tell stories in ways that invites them to come not once, but regularly? How do we get people to feel comfortable thinking of this as their museum all the time? To me, a healthy museum environment is one where people feel they can come routinely to the museum and not just once. We all know that some people come and say, yeah, I saw all of that. And my kids will come and see it in 25 years, and then we can check that off the list. But if you think of it as a living institution, if you're a local institution, that means you need to turn things over enough so there's something new all the time, so people have things to come and see. Doesn't mean they have to be expensive exhibitions, but how do you create a program that's dynamic and vital enough to do that? So I think it's really about being sensitive and accountable to understanding who you want to attract and how to do that, and what do they need to feel welcome. And as I say, that would vary by every town and every museum.
And I would just point out, in terms of that resources conversation, the Getty certainly, and perhaps also Crystal Bridges, but
yes.
Right. Alice Walton and with Art Bridges is presenting a model for future possibilities, which is where bigger museums and smaller museums, more regional community-based museums come together and can share collections, or at least have the opportunity to share those collections and resources, logistical support and whatnot. So I think that model is actually a really interesting one moving forward.
I agree. She's really a visionary, Alice Walton, in the way she's created organizations to do that.
We have time for one or two more questions.
I just think this was a wonderful event, and perhaps if it was being translated in another room in Spanish, you may have doubled your population tonight.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking when we were thinking about the technology question is how important technology can be. It can be scary in some levels, but in terms of expanding access, it can be incredibly valuable, right? We have something just integrated onto the back end of our website that allows you to, explore the website in, I think, a dozen languages. And and it has different accessibility features, and I think the future with AI and all of that can certainly be used where we're very proud of having all of our signage bilingual English Spanish in our galleries, But I think technology can really play a role of expanding that so that if someone comes in that speaks, Vietnamese, that there's a path forward to enjoying and accessing the collection and the didactics. But points very well taken, of course.
That's a good example of technology. Languages are no longer a barrier for anyone.
I guess I wonder, when you're gathering your art for your museum, when it becomes enough. When you say you have 1 million pieces of art at the Met, and I lived in New York for a really long time, I've never turned right when I got into the Met in my life. So I'll get it and turn, I've never even turned right yet. So I know that I've not seen a lot. And I'm just wondering...
Egypt, you haven't seen Egypt.
It's embarrassing. Someday I'll turn to the right. But I feel like you have 1 million objects. When is it time to share the collection that is hidden somewhere that most of us have never and will never see? Is it a possibility to share them with another museum, to do something to get them out into the public realm again? And and I don't even think you need to be a big museum to have artwork in the basement. And I'm just wondering, when is enough enough?
Well, it's a good question, and so a couple of answers to that. First of all, just to say slightly whimsically that people in the museum business, curators, they like to collect. Like, they like to shop. That's what they do. And the question, though, is when I was at the Met, people were getting stuff all the time, and I said, okay, we're going to set out a rule. Tell me when this is going to get on the wall in the museum. Well, it'll never be on view. Then why are we getting, well, it's an important contributor to the story of this or that. I said, well, that's not a great argument, because what you're really doing is you're taking it out of the public domain and you're burying it. So we stopped doing that. And that, again, collectors, curators, they want to tell the story. They know that the walls are limited, but if we can just have this early example and this late example. So one needs to exercise discipline, and I think one way to think about that is, if you don't have a good answer for what your plans are to exhibit something, then you should de-accession it or loan it out. To the Met, again, I know more about the Met than the Philadelphia Museum at this point. The Met has loans all over the place that are on long-term loan. I went to Emory University to give a lecture, and the Michael Carlos Museum is full of things from the Met that I didn't even know were there. So that happens, but it's easy to just get stuff and stick it in storage and forget about it, so every museum is guilty of that. When I first started at the Met, I went around to all the departments to meet the curators and the staff, and I went to the print and drawings department, which is a different category because a lot of what they have can't be on view all the time. It's light sensitive. But I was talking a good game about how I wanted to help and what do you need? And the person in charge of managing the collection, who I think was incapable of smiling or laughing no matter how hard I tried, she said to me, President Weiss, I would just like you to know, if we stop collecting today and we don't take one more thing, and we continue with the amount of staff you allow us to have, I'd been at the museum for like a week, so it was my fault. It will take us about 10,000 years to enter into the records what we already have here. And so I said, next question? What do you want me to say to that? But it is an evidence of this desire to get stuff because it's important. So I think every museum has to ask that question. And can you loan it, or why do you want to own it? I'll say one more thing, which is slightly indiscreet, but it's true of every museum, including the Met's. If we were to go on a tour of our storage, you'd say, not so great. A lot of the stuff that's there is there because Freddie Smith gave us 5 Van Goghs and 35 paintings by Skippy Schmedlap that aren't very nice. And they have to be in the collection the whole time. So the Schmedlaps are in a building you're never going to go in. The idea would be to say to them in the first place, the Van Goghs will be on the wall, but these things don't belong here. But many museums haven't done that. So they're like your attic, and you think, I don't remember when I put that up there, and why is it here? Same thing.
I'm writing the catalog raisonné on Schmedlap. I would also just say, add to that, just sort of nibbling around the edges, though, versus the more sort of philosophical answer there. But we started regular rotations every 6 months, about a third of the works on view rotate off, just to get more out there. And also, I think the Met has a wonderful example of visible storage, right, in the American wing, which is another, again, nibbling around the edges, but a sort of practical application that museums can do to at least get more out there. And visible storage is something that we're seriously thinking about for the design of our new building.
That's great. Good idea.
Yeah, last question right there. So, is that Melissa?
Just to bring us back into the Lehigh Valley and thinking of, you have both come from so many different places. When museums have the opportunity to potentially do what could be happening here in Allentown, how have you seen communities transform through a new museum, or how have you heard or researched that? What transformation could happen either civically, culturally, through the arts with having a new museum in the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. That what tends to happen is when you live in a museum, everybody loves certain parts of the museum and other parts they'd love to change. So it's an opportunity to take the good and expand on it and create something entirely new. The transformational opportunity is, in a sense, to reinvent the institution in ways that might enhance the delivery of mission. And so if you think about what works well here and what doesn't work well here, if we really want to engage students and we really want to be more of a tourist attraction or whatever it is, really want to highlight these pictures versus those, you can create a space that does that. That might be out of fashion again in 25 or 50 years, but that's why I said it's so important to think about the long term. Think about your successors, because you're going to get to do this once a century or something. Get it right. So it means really thinking about that, talking to people, listening to their ideas, and then creating something that everybody's really excited about. And in the first instance, people will all show up to see what you've got. And if you do it well, they'll come back. If you don't do it well, they'll say, yeah, I saw it. Okay, it's not that great. And so I think the process can be exhilarating if you're really out there listening. And again, I love architects. Be a good client, because they're coming and they're going and they have a project, so make them work for you. And if you do those things, you can really light a community and transform them. And I've seen museums do that in ways that's really exciting. Great opportunity here. And it's a great moment for Allentown. All the wonderful work that's happened here in the last few years to lift the city and create opportunities, you can be part of that in ways that helps to galvanize and really affirm what this city can be. So it's a perfect moment.
That's a mic drop, I think, right there. So, Dan, thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts.
Thanks for having me.